2 o'clock in the morning, February 14th, 1945. Sergeant Jack Hayes sat in an open bucket seat mounted on the back of a 12-ton half-track 10 feet above the Philippine mud. The vehicle beneath him was painted olive drab, but in the moonless dark of the Luzon jungle, it looked like a jagged shadow, a metal beast crouched and waiting. Hayes was 22 years old, he was soaking wet, and he was currently the most hated man in the entire sector. The jungle in front of him was a solid wall of black vines and rotting mahogany trees. He could hear movement in there, the breaking of twigs, the shifting of wet leaves, the low, heavy voices of men gathering for a rush. The Japanese Imperial Army was out there massing for a counterattack, and Hayes sat exposed in a metal chair, gripping the spade handles of a weapon that everyone told him was useless. The infantrymen of the 25th Division, dug into foxholes in a defensive semicircle around his vehicle, looked at the half-track with pure disgust. They called it the Dragon Wagon. They called it the target magnet. In a war fought by men crawling on their bellies through sludge, a 10-foot-tall truck is impossible to hide. It stuck out like a neon billboard in a graveyard. Every time Hayes started the engine, the loud noise drew Japanese mortar fire. Every time he moved, the treads chewed up the only supply road, turning it into a river of chocolate pudding. The infantry captain had spent the last 3 days trying to get Hayes sent back to the rear. He argued that an anti-aircraft weapon had no place on the front line. He screamed that there were no Japanese planes in the sky, so Hayes was just a tourist parked in a combat zone, endangering real soldiers with his oversized toy. But 72 hours earlier, that same captain had wanted Hayes dead for a different reason entirely. How a 22-year-old mechanic with a 75-cent wrench ended up holding the line against 800 screaming Japanese soldiers is a story about the gap between what the manual says and what reality demands. It's about a man who learned that sometimes fixing something right means breaking the rules. And it's about the night a rejected weapon became the most feared killing machine in the Pacific Theater. This is that story. Detroit, Michigan, summer of 1943. Jack Hayes worked in a garage that smelled like motor oil and old coffee. He was 19 then, lean and wiry with hands that could rebuild a carburetor blindfolded. The sign above the door said Hayes Auto Repair, same as it had when his father ran the place. But his father was dead. Henry Hayes had died in a factory accident in 1938. A hydraulic press at the steel mill, improperly maintained, had crushed him while Jack was in the 8th grade. The accident report said mechanical failure. The truth was simpler. Someone had skipped a maintenance check. Someone had decided that keeping the line running was more important than fixing a worn seal. Jack's mother had delivered his father's last words secondhand, spoken to a coworker in the moments before the press came down. Fix it right or don't fix it at all. Lives depend on it. Those words became the operating principle of Jack Hayes' life. When he took over the garage at 17 to support his 2 younger siblings, he didn't just fix cars. He perfected them. A customer might bring in a Ford with a rough idle. Jack wouldn't just adjust the carburetor. He'd strip it down, rebuild it, test it, and hand it back running, smoother than the day it rolled off the assembly line. His younger brother Danny, 16, thought Jack was obsessive. His sister Mary, 12, just knew that Jack worked late every night and never talked about their father. But Jack couldn't help it. Every time he tightened a bolt, he heard his father's voice. Every time he cut a corner, he saw that hydraulic press coming down. Fix it right. Lives depend on it. In December of 1943, Danny announced he was enlisting. He was too young, but he had a friend who knew a recruiter who didn't ask too many questions. Danny saw the war as an adventure, a ticket out of the garage, and the grief that hung over their house like smoke. Jack made him a deal. I'll go. You stay. Someone has to take care of Mary, Danny argued. Jack didn't budge. And in January of 1944, Jack Hayes walked into an Army recruiting station and signed his name. He didn't want to be a soldier. He wanted to keep his brother alive. Basic training at Fort Knox revealed 2 things about Private Jack Hayes. First, he had the best mechanical aptitude scores the instructors had ever seen. Second, he had the worst attitude toward authority they'd encountered in months. When the drill sergeant ordered the platoon to clean their rifles using the standard 3-step process outlined in the manual, Hayes would nod, then take his rifle apart completely clean, every component individually, and reassemble it with modifications he'd read about in a mechanic's journal. The rifle worked better. The sergeant didn't care. Following orders mattered more than results. Hayes scored top marks in every technical exam. He also racked up more disciplinary warnings than anyone in his company, not for being lazy or disrespectful, for being too good, for fixing things that weren't broken according to the manual, but were broken according to reality. His instructors didn't know what to do with him, so they sent him to anti-aircraft artillery school. The M16 multiple-gun motor carriage was a marvel of engineering and a nightmare of logistics. It consisted of 450 caliber M2 machine guns mounted in a powered turret on the back of an M3 half-track. The turret could rotate 360 degrees. It could traverse 60 degrees per second. It had an electric motor, a gasoline generator, and enough wires and batteries to make a grown man weep. On paper, this was a precision instrument designed to track and destroy low-flying fighter planes. The 4 guns arranged in a square pattern with 2 on each side could put 2,000 rounds per minute into the sky. It was fast, agile, and terrifyingly complex. Jack Hayes loved it immediately. For the first time since his father's death, he felt like he was working with a machine that matched his skill level. The other trainees saw a maintenance disaster. Hayes saw a mechanical symphony. He learned every system, every circuit, every potential failure point. He stayed after hours stripping and rebuilding the traverse motors, timing the feed mechanisms, calibrating the sights. His instructor, a grizzled sergeant who'd been teaching anti-aircraft for 2 years, watched Hayes work one evening and shook his head. "Best hands I've seen," he said. "Worst attitude toward authority. You're either going to win the war or get court-martialed. Maybe both." In September of 1944, Hayes shipped out to the Pacific. His orders said he was assigned to the 25th Infantry Division as an anti-aircraft specialist. What they didn't say was that by the time he arrived, the Japanese Air Force was almost non-existent in his sector. The Zeros were gone. The air belonged to America, which meant Hayes was bringing an anti-aircraft gun to a ground war. Luzon, Philippines, January 1945. The island was a green hell of jungle and rain and heat that made your uniform stick to your skin like wet paper. Hayes arrived with his half-track and his quad mount and a maintenance crew of 2 privates who looked at the massive vehicle like it was a dinosaur that had wandered onto the wrong battlefield. The 25th Infantry Division was fighting its way through the jungle toward Manila, and they were fighting hard. The Japanese forces weren't surrendering. They were digging into caves and bamboo thickets, turning every ridge into a fortress. And at night, when American air superiority meant nothing in the dark, they were launching banzai attacks. Captain Thomas Morrison commanded the rifle company that Hayes was assigned to support. Morrison was 40 years old, a veteran of World War I who'd seen combat at Belleau Wood. He had a face like weathered leather and eyes that had stopped being surprised by anything 25 years ago. When Hayes drove his half-track into the company perimeter, Morrison walked over, looked up at the 10-foot-tall vehicle, and spit tobacco juice into the mud. Another anti-aircraft tourist, Morrison said, "Just what I needed." Hayes started to explain that he was assigned for air defense, but Morrison cut him off. "Son, the last Japanese plane I saw was 3 months ago, and it was on fire. You know what I do see? I see a vehicle that's loud as hell, tears up my supply road, and makes a perfect target for every mortar crew within 5 miles. So do me a favor, park that thing in the rear and stay out of my way." The infantrymen nearby laughed. A private with burned skin on his face and a Polish name stenciled on his helmet stepped forward. His name was Eddie Kowalski, and he had the kind of smile that made you check your wallet afterward. "Hey, Captain Kowalski said you think we can use it as a latrine? At least then it'd serve some purpose." More laughter. Morrison didn't stop it. He just walked away, leaving Hayes standing beside his vehicle, with 24 infantry soldiers staring at him like he'd personally insulted their mothers. Hayes wanted to argue. He wanted to explain that the M45 quad mount properly employed could deliver more firepower than anything else in the sector. But Morrison had already disappeared into his command post. And besides, Hayes didn't know if that was true. The manual said the weapon was for shooting down planes. Using it against ground targets wasn't just unauthorized, it was considered a waste of ammunition. So Hayes parked his half-track at the edge of the perimeter near a cluster of mahogany trees that provided some concealment and tried to stay out of the way. That lasted about 18 hours. On his second night in position, Hayes was performing routine maintenance on the generator when he heard the distant thump of mortar tubes. 3 seconds later, shells started falling. They weren't aimed at the infantry positions. They were aimed at his half-track. The explosions walked across the clearing, getting closer with each round. Shrapnel pinged off the armored sides of the vehicle. Hayes dove into a foxhole that one of his crew had dug, pressed his face into the mud, and waited for it to stop. When the barrage ended, he climbed out and surveyed the damage. The half-track was fine. The surrounding area looked like the moon, and two infantrymen who'd been in foxholes near the vehicle had been wounded by shrapnel. Morrison appeared at Hayes' side, his face dark with anger. "Your engine," Morrison said quietly. "They heard your goddamn engine and used it to range their mortars." Hayes opened his mouth to apologize, but Morrison kept talking. "Two of my boys are bleeding because you decided to run a tune-up at 9 p.m. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to shut that thing down. You're not going to start it, move it, or make a sound with it unless I personally give you permission. And first thing tomorrow, I'm requesting you get transferred back to an airfield where you can play mechanic without getting my men killed." Morrison walked away. The wounded men were carried to the aid station, and Hayes sat on the fender of his half-track listening to the jungle and feeling the weight of every pair of eyes in the company staring at him with pure hatred. Kowalski walked past close enough that Hayes could smell the cigarette smoke on his uniform. "Nice work, tourist," Kowalski said. "Two guys down because you couldn't keep your toy quiet. You gonna fix that with your magic wrench?" Hayes said nothing. There was nothing to say. Kowalski was right. The wounded were right. Morrison was right. The Dragon Wagon was a liability, and Hayes was the fool riding it. That night, Hayes wrote a letter to Danny that he never sent. It said, "I thought I was protecting you by coming here. Now I'm just the guy everyone wants gone. Dad would be ashamed." The problem with the Japanese bonsai attack wasn't just that it was terrifying. It was that the math didn't work. Hayes learned this 3 days after Morrison threatened to transfer him when the company assembled for a briefing about recent engagements in adjacent sectors. Morrison stood in front of a map pointing to red X marks that indicated where American positions had been overrun. Sector 7, Morrison said, was hit on February 7th. Full platoon strength, 40 men. They had machine gun nests, prepared positions, overlapping fields of fire. Everything by the book. The Japanese launched a bonsai charge at 0200 hours, estimated 500 attackers. The position was overrun in under 2 minutes. 40 Americans dead. He moved his finger to another X. Sector 12, February 10th. Different story. They held the line. But they took 60% casualties doing it. Their machine guns overheated, barrels warped, had to switch to rifles. Half the company was wounded or dead by sunrise. Morrison looked around at his men. His face was grim. The pattern is clear. When they mass for a night attack, our standard weapons can't generate enough sustained fire to stop them. The .30 caliber machine guns overheat. The riflemen run out of ammunition. And if you can't stop a bonsai charge in the first 30 seconds, you don't stop it at all. It rolls over you like a freight train. Hayes sat in the back listening. He was there because Morrison had ordered everyone to attend, but Hayes wasn't really part of the company. He was the outsider with the useless truck. Near the front, Kowalski sat with his squad, occasionally glancing back at Hayes, with a look that suggested he was still mad about the mortar incident. But Hayes was also a mechanic, and mechanics think in terms of problems and solutions. And as Morrison described the technical gap between what the infantry had and what they needed, Hayes started doing math in his head. A bonsai charge covered 80 yards in about 10 seconds. That's how long you had to break the attack. A standard M1 Garand rifle held 8 rounds. A trained soldier could fire all 8 in about 6 seconds reload and fire 8 more. That's 16 bullets per man in the critical window. Morrison's company had 50 riflemen. 16 times 50 is 800 rounds. Sounds like a lot until you remember that each bullet can only stop one man, and a bonsai charge might have 500 to 1,000 attackers. And that's assuming every shot hits, which in the dark under stress, with targets moving at a full sprint, was optimistic at best. The machine guns were better. The M1919 Browning .30 caliber could fire 400 to 600 rounds per minute, but it had to be fired in bursts to prevent overheating. And after about 2 minutes of sustained fire, you had to change the barrel, which took 30 seconds if you were good and didn't burn your hands. 30 seconds was enough time for the entire charge to reach your position. Hayes did the math. The infantry didn't have enough firepower to stop a massed attack. Not with their current weapons. Not by the book. But Hayes had a weapon that could fire 2,000 rounds per minute. Four 50 caliber machine guns, air-cooled, capable of sustained fire, far beyond what the infantry guns could manage. 50 caliber rounds that could punch through cover the 30 caliber couldn't touch. There was just one problem. The weapon was aimed at the squadron. A voice interrupted his thoughts. You thinking about running away, tourist? Hayes looked up. Kowalski stood over him in arms crossed. The rest of the briefing had broken up. Men were filing out. Hayes had been so lost in calculations he hadn't noticed. Just thinking, Hayes said. Kowalski snorted. Thinking won't help when they come screaming out of that jungle. You ever seen a bonsai charge number 1? I have. Sector 12. I was there when we lost 30 guys in 5 minutes. You know what your toy gun was doing during that, sitting in the rear pointing at empty sky? Real useful. Hayes met his eyes. What if it wasn't pointing at the sky? Kowalski blinked. What? The quad mount. What if it was aimed at the ground? You mean like a regular machine gun? Not regular? Better. 450s instead of 130. 2,000 rounds a minute instead of 600. Kowalski stared at him for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was a harsh, bitter sound. You really are a tourist. That thing's set up for planes. 600-yard range. Useless in the jungle. Even if Morrison lets you use it, which he won't, you just waste ammo shooting trees. Hayes didn't argue, because Kowalski was right. The factory settings made the weapon useless at close range. But Hayes was already thinking about a 75-cent wrench and the principles of convergence geometry. Kowalski walked away still chuckling. Hayes sat alone in the empty tent listening to the rain hammer the canvas roof and knew what he had to do. That evening, Hayes was cleaning carbon buildup from the quad mount's feed mechanism when he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up and saw a slender soldier in a rain poncho rifle slung over his shoulder. The man's face was partially obscured by the hood, but Hayes could see enough to tell he was young, maybe 19, with features that suggested Asian ancestry. The soldier stopped a few feet from the half-track. Permission to approach, Sergeant Hayes wiped his hands on a rag. Yeah, come on up. The soldier climbed onto the vehicle and pushed back his hood. His name was Jimmy Chen. Hayes had seen him around the perimeter but never spoken to him. Chen was a sniper, one of the few Chinese Americans in the division, and he spent most of his time in an observation post on the ridge overlooking the company area. Chen looked at the quad mount, at the 4 massive barrels, at the complex electrical systems. I heard what you said to Kowalski, he said quietly, about aiming it at the ground. Hayes tensed. You gonna report me for talking out of turn? Numb Chen met his eyes. I'm gonna ask if you meant it. Hayes studied him. Chen's expression was serious, no trace of mockery or skepticism, just genuine curiosity. Why do you care? Because I've been watching the way this company fights, Chen said. And I've been doing the same math you were doing in that briefing. We don't have enough firepower to stop a mass attack. The 30s overheat, the rifles run dry. Morrison knows it, everyone knows it. We're just waiting to see which night we get hit. Hayes said nothing. Chen continued. My father taught engineering at Berkeley before the war. I grew up around machines, around systems. I know what convergence means. I know your guns are set for aerial targets, but I also know that mechanically, there's no reason they couldn't be adjusted for groundwork. Hayes felt something shift in his chest. Finally, someone who understood. You know, if Morrison finds out I'm even thinking about modifying a military weapon without authorization, he'll have me court-martialed. Probably. Chen glanced toward the command post, then back at Hayes. But you're thinking about doing it anyway, aren't you? Hayes didn't answer directly. Why are you here, Chen? Chen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because people look at my face and see the enemy. I'm American, born in San Francisco. But every day someone in this company looks at me and sees a Japanese soldier. Some guys won't share a foxhole with me. Kowalski calls me names he thinks I don't hear. I joined up to prove I'm loyal, to prove I'm one of you. But it doesn't matter what I do. I'm still the outsider. He paused. You're an outsider too. The guy with the useless gun, the tourist. We're both trying to prove we belong. Difference is you actually have a way to do it. Hayes looked at Chen, at this 19-year-old kid who'd enlisted to fight for a country that didn't fully trust him, and felt a kinship he hadn't expected. What are you proposing? Chen pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was covered in pencil sketches and calculations. Ground convergence at 200 yards, he said. I did the geometry. If you angle each barrel inward by approximately 1.5 degrees, all 4 streams will meet at 200 yards. That's the typical engagement range in this jungle. You'd create a kill zone instead of parallel fire. Hayes took the paper, studied the math. It was correct. Chen had done in his spare time what Hayes had been circling around in his head for days. You know this is against regulations, Hayes said. I know. Chen's expression didn't change. I also know that regulations won't stop a bonsai charge, but that gun might. Hayes folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. I'd need to test it, make sure the math translates to reality. Chen nodded. Tonight, after everyone's asleep, I'll help you set up targets. Hayes hesitated, feeling the weight of the decision. If they were caught, both their careers were over. If they succeeded but Morrison found out same result. But if they did nothing and the company got hit by a human wave attack, men would die. Men like Kowalski who hated Hayes but didn't deserve to be overrun because the tools were wrong. Fix it, right as father had said. Lives depend on it. All right, Hayes said, tonight. At 2300 hours, while the rest of the company slept, Hayes and Chen slipped out of the perimeter. They carried 8 empty ammunition crates and a small can of white paint. They paced off 200 yards from the half-track, moving slowly through the mud to avoid making noise, and stacked the crates in a rough pyramid. Hayes painted a white X on the center crate. Then they returned to the half-track. Hayes pulled a wrench from his toolkit. It had cost 75 cents at the post exchange. Standard issue, nothing special. He climbed into the turret and began loosening the mounting bolts that held the 4 machine guns in place. Each gun had 4 bolts, 16 total. He worked in darkness, feeling the threads by touch, his hands moving with the muscle memory of 10,000 carburetor adjustments. Chen kept watch, scanning the tree line for any sign of Japanese patrols or worse, American officers who might come investigating. When all 16 bolts were loose, Hayes began the delicate work of adjusting each gun barrel. He needed them to angle inward to look slightly crossed so that their trajectories would meet at the white X 200 yards away. Too much angle and they'd converge too soon, too little, and they'd still be parallel. He used the iron sights on each gun, lining them up with the white mark in the distance. Left gun, right gun, top of bottom, tiny adjustments, a quarter turn of the mounting bracket, check the sight line, adjust again. It took an hour. When he was done, he tightened all 16 bolts and told Chen to get ready. Ready for what, Chen asked. Hayes didn't answer. He climbed into the gunner's seat, engaged the turret drive, and aimed at the distant stack of crates. His thumb hovered over the firing trigger. This was the moment of truth. If he'd calculated wrong, if the angles were off, the test would fail and he'd have wasted an hour. If he'd calculated right and the modification worked, he'd have proven that an unauthorized change to military equipment could save lives. But there was a third possibility. If Morrison heard the guns and came to investigate, Hayes would be explaining himself to a very angry captain. Chen seemed to read his mind. Do it, he said quietly. If it works, it's worth the risk. Hayes pressed the trigger. The 4 guns erupted. The noise was tremendous, a hammering roar that shook the jungle and sent birds screaming into the night sky. Tracers streaked through the darkness, 4 bright lines that started parallel and then bent inward, converging like the fingers of a closing fist. At exactly 200 yards, all 4 streams of fire met at the white X. The ammunition crates exploded into splinters. The tracer rounds formed a single point of light, a focused beam that looked less like machine gun fire and more like a cutting torch. Hayes released the trigger. The guns fell silent. The echoes faded. And in the sudden quiet, Hayes and Chen stared at the results. Where the stack of crates had been, there was now a smoking crater. Chen whispered a single word, damn. Before Hayes could respond, they heard boots pounding across the clearing. Morrison was running toward the half-track, rifle in hand, face twisted with fury. Behind him came 3 other soldiers, including Kowalski. Hayes climbed down from the turret, bracing himself. This was it. Court-martial. Dishonorable discharge. Maybe worse. Morrison reached the vehicle, breathing hard. He looked at Hayes, at Chen at the turret. Then he looked downrange at the smoking crater where the crates had been. What the hell was that? Morrison demanded. Hayes swallowed. A test, sir. I modified the gun's convergence to 200 yards for ground targets. Morrison's expression was unreadable. You modified a military weapon without authorization. Yes, sir. And you fired it in the middle of the night without clearing it with me. Yes, sir. Morrison was silent for a long moment. Kowalski stood behind him, arms crossed, a satisfied smirk on his face like he was watching Hayes dig his own grave. Then Morrison did something unexpected. He walked past Hayes toward the crater. He stood there in the rain staring at the destroyed crates, at the chewed-up earth, at the splinters, scattered across 20 feet of jungle. When he came back, his face was different. The anger was still there, but underneath it was something else. Something that might have been hope, or calculation, or the desperate willingness to try anything that might keep his men alive. "Show me the math," Morrison said. They spent the next hour in Morrison's tent. Hayes spread Chen's sketches on the field desk, explaining convergence angles and firing arcs, while Morrison listened in silence. Kowalski had followed them and still skeptical, but Morrison hadn't sent him away. When Hayes finished, Morrison leaned back in his chair. "You understand what you've done is a court-martial offense." "Yes, sir." "You've modified Army equipment without authorization. You've discharged weapons without orders. You've endangered the perimeter by firing at night and potentially giving away our position." "Yes, sir." Morrison looked at the sketches again. "You've also just shown me the first solution I've seen to the bonsai problem." He tapped the paper. "If this works in actual combat, not just against stationary crates, you might have just saved this entire company." Kowalski spoke up from the corner. "Captain, you can't seriously be considering this. The regs are clear." Morrison cut him off. "The regs also say we're supposed to hold this position against whatever the Japanese throw at us. And right now, with our current weapons, I don't think we can do that." He looked at Hayes. "How much ammunition do you have for that thing?" 4,000 rounds, sir, plus another 2,000 in reserve. And the gun can sustain fire without overheating. "Air-cooled, sir. I can fire continuously for minutes if needed. The .30 calibers can't do that." Morrison nodded slowly. He seemed to be working through something in his mind, weighing regulations against reality. Finally, he said, "Here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow, you're going to prepare that weapon for ground combat. I want belts loaded, systems checked, everything ready. Tomorrow night, if we don't get hit, you do nothing. But if the Japanese come and if I give you the order, you light them up." Hayes felt his heart hammering. "You're authorizing this." Sir Morrison's eyes were hard. "I'm telling you to be ready. If you fire without my direct order, I'll have you arrested. If you fire with my order and it doesn't work, we're both going to be explaining ourselves to a very angry general. But if it works," he trailed off. "If it works, maybe we all live to see March." Kowalski shook his head. "This is insane." Morrison looked at him. "You got a better idea, Private, because I'm all ears. We've lost 80 men in the last 2 weeks to bonsai attacks. 80. I will try anything, including a mechanic's crazy idea if it means I stop writing letters to mothers." Kowalski had no answer to that. Morrison turned back to Hayes. "Get some sleep, Sergeant. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. And if Chen helped you with this, he gets credit too. I don't care what his last name is. He's one of my soldiers." Chen, who'd been standing quietly by the tent flap, looked surprised, then grateful. Hayes and Chen left the tent together. Outside, the rain had stopped. The jungle was quiet except for the usual night sounds. They walked back toward the half-track without speaking. Finally, Chen said, "Think he'll actually let you use it?" Hayes thought about Morrison's face, about the desperation behind the anger, about 80 dead men and the letters to mothers. "Yeah," he said, "I think he will." But Hayes didn't know that the test would come sooner than any of them expected. And he didn't know that within 24 hours he'd go from the most hated man in the company to the only thing standing between them and annihilation. February 13th, the sky was low and gray, heavy with rain that never quite fell. Hayes spent the morning working on the quad mount with an intensity that bordered on obsession. First, the ammunition. The standard loadout for anti-aircraft work was a mix of ball tracer and armor-piercing rounds. Ball for killing, tracer for tracking, armor-piercing for punching through aircraft aluminum. But Hayes wasn't fighting aircraft. He was fighting men behind logs and bamboo. He spent 3 hours breaking down the factory-loaded belts and rebuilding them by hand. He swapped out the standard ball rounds for armor-piercing, incendiary API rounds. These bullets had a tungsten core to punch through barriers and a chemical tip that ignited on impact. Against soft targets like sandbags or flesh, they acted like explosive matches. Against hard cover like tree trunks, they punched through and set fires on the other side. He also increased his tracer ratio. Standard was 1 tracer every 5 rounds. Hayes changed it to 1 every 3. In the dark, he wanted to see exactly where his fire was going. He wanted a solid stream of light. While Hayes worked, Corporal Sam Washington approached the half-track. Washington was 25, a black soldier from Detroit, who'd worked at the same steel mill where Hayes' father had died. They'd never met before the war, but when Washington learned Hayes was from Detroit, He'd made a point of introducing himself. Washington climbed onto the vehicle and watched Hayes feed the new belts into the ammunition chests. "Heard you got Morrison's permission to go crazy," Washington said. Hayes didn't look up. Not permission, more like a stay of execution. Washington chuckled. "Same thing in this army." He picked up one of the API rounds, turned it over in his hand. "You really think this is going to work against a human wave?" Hayes paused. "Honestly, I don't know. The math says yes. The test fire says yes. But I've never done this in combat." Washington set the round down carefully. "For what it's worth, I hope you're right. Lost a lot of friends to bonsai charges. If you can stop one, you'll be a hero." Hayes shook his head. "I don't want to be a hero. I just want to keep my brother from having to do this." Washington was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your brother's lucky, having someone who cares that much." He patted the side of the half-track. "You need anything, you let me know. Ammo, food, an extra pair of hands. I got you." "Thanks," Hayes said. And he meant it. As Washington left, Kowalski appeared. He didn't say anything, just stood there watching Hayes work with an expression that suggested he was waiting for Hayes to fail. Hayes ignored him and kept working. He checked the generator fuel. He tested the battery connections. He cleaned the optical sight until the glass was crystal clear. He ran the traverse motor through a full rotation, listening for any grinding or hesitation in the gears. Everything had to be perfect, because if Morrison gave the order and the gun jammed, if the generator failed, if anything went wrong, men would die. And Hayes would have to live with knowing he'd had the tool to save them, but hadn't maintained it properly. Fix it right. Lives depend on it. Night fell like a curtain. Hayes sat in the turret watching the jungle turn from green to black. Morrison had authorized radio silence to avoid giving away positions, so the only sounds were the usual night chorus of insects and the occasional crack of a tree branch settling. At 2200 hours, Chen's voice crackled over the company radio net. "OP to command, movement in the north sector, multiple contacts." Morrison's response was immediate. "How many? Hard to say in the dark. At least 20. Maybe more. They're not trying to hide." Hayes felt his stomach tighten. This was it. Not a full bonsai charge, but a probe. The Japanese were testing the defenses, trying to find weak points. Morrison's voice came over the radio again, this time directed at all positions. "All units, weapons tight. Do not fire unless fired upon. I want to see what they're doing." Hayes waited. His hands gripped the spade handles of the quad mount, but he didn't engage the turret drive. Not yet. Not without orders. Then he heard it. The heavy, rhythmic thump of a Japanese Type 92 machine gun. The sound was distinctive, slower than the American guns, with a mechanical heartbeat quality that had earned it the nickname Woodpecker. The muzzle flash was visible from Hayes's position, a flickering strobe light deep in the bamboo thicket about 200 yards out. The gun was firing in bursts, walking rounds across the American foxholes, trying to pin the infantry down. The American machine gunners returned fire. Hayes could hear the faster chatter of the 30 caliber Brownings see their tracers reaching out toward the enemy position. But the Japanese gun was well protected. The American rounds were hitting the bamboo, the logs, the dirt berm, but not the gun itself. The Woodpecker kept firing, and now Hayes could hear another sound underneath it. Voices. Japanese soldiers moving through the jungle, using the machine gun's suppressive fire as cover to advance. Morrison's voice cut through the radio traffic. "Hayes, you see that gun?" "Yes, sir. Can you hit it?" Hayes looked through his optical sight. The red glowing ring hovered over the enemy muzzle flash. 200 yards, exactly where he'd set the convergence. "Yes, sir, I can hit it. Then do it. Now." Hayes kicked the pedal that engaged the turret drive. The electric motor accelerated with a rising whine. He placed the red ring directly over the flickering light of the Japanese gun. He didn't fire a warning shot. He didn't fire a short burst. He clamped both thumbs down on the butterfly triggers and held them. All 4 M2 machine guns erupted at once. The sound was physically painful, a rhythmic hammering that vibrated through the chassis of the half-track and shook the ground. The muzzle blast from 450 calibers firing simultaneously created a shockwave that blew the range sideways. The effect downrange was instantaneous and horrific. The 4 streams of tracers converging perfectly at 200 yards hit the bamboo thicket like a solid bar of fire. The bamboo didn't just break, it evaporated. The heavy tungsten cord bullets smashed through the green stalks, through the dirt berm, and through the logs of the Japanese bunker position. The incendiary tips ignited on impact, creating a shower of sparks that looked like a welding torch cutting through steel. The woodpecker machine gun stopped firing immediately. The bunker itself seemed to disintegrate. The logs shattered into splinters the size of toothpicks. The earth around the position boiled as hundreds of rounds slammed into it every second. Hayes held the trigger for 3 full seconds. In that time, he put 150 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition into a space the size of a kitchen table. When he released the triggers, the silence that followed was deafening. The Japanese machine gun was gone. The bamboo thicket was gone. In its place was a smoking, glowing crater of chewed-up vegetation and earth. The American infantrymen slowly lifted their heads from the mud. They looked at the devastation, then back at the half-track. They weren't laughing anymore. They weren't calling it the Dragon Wagon or the Target Magnet. They were staring at it like they just witnessed something that shouldn't exist. Kowalski stood up in his foxhole rifle, forgotten in his hands. His mouth was open. The satisfied smirk was gone, replaced by something that looked like awe mixed with fear. Morrison climbed out of his command post and walked toward the destroyed enemy position, rifle ready. He reached the edge of the crater, looked down, and then looked back at Hayes. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His expression said everything. The target magnet had just become the biggest stick in the valley. But the Japanese weren't done. They'd seen the tracers. They knew exactly where the fire had come from. And they realized that the Americans had a new weapon, something that could cut through their cover like paper. Hayes heard the whistle. It was a sharp trilling sound that cut through the rain coming from deep in the jungle. It was the signal for escalation. Chen's voice crackled over the radio, urgent now. OP to command. I've got movement all across the northern sector. They're massing, Morrison keyed his radio. How many? A lot. I'm seeing torchlights. They're not hiding anymore. Hayes checked his ammunition chests. He'd burned through the first layer of belts in that 3-second burst. He had thousands of rounds left, but suddenly it didn't feel like enough. Morrison appeared at the side of the half-track. His face was grim but determined. Hayes, I need you to understand something. What you just did. That was impressive, but it also put a target on your back. Every Japanese soldier in this sector now knows we have something that can tear through their positions. They're going to try to destroy it. I understand, sir. Good. Morrison paused. Because in about 30 minutes, I think they're going to hit us with everything they have. And you're going to be the first thing they try to kill. Hayes felt his mouth go dry. What do you need me to do? Stay on that gun. When they come, and they will come, you light them up. Don't wait for my order. You see targets, you fire. Understood. Yes, sir. Morrison started to walk away, then stopped. Hayes, that thing about court-martialing you? Forget it. You just saved a dozen of my men. Whatever happens tonight, you've earned your place here. He walked back toward the command post, shouting orders. Hayes heard him calling for ammunition resupply for the mortar team to prepare illumination rounds for every available rifleman to strengthen the northern perimeter. Washington appeared at the half-track with Kowalski and another private. They were carrying heavy ammunition crates, the reserve stock Hayes had mentioned earlier. Without being asked, they climbed onto the vehicle and began swapping out the partially empty chests for fresh ones. Kowalski worked in silence, but when the job was done, he looked at Hayes. His expression was complicated, like he was trying to reconcile the tourist he'd mocked with the man who just deleted a bunker in 3 seconds. Don't make me regret helping you tourists, Kowalski said. Then quieter, almost reluctantly, that was some shooting. It was the closest thing to an apology Hayes was going to get. Washington clapped Hayes on the shoulder. We got your back, kid. You just keep that gun running. They jumped down and returned to their positions. Hayes was alone again in the turret, surrounded by fresh ammunition, staring into the darkness. The jungle had gone quiet. No insects, no birds, just the whisper of wind through the trees and the sound of his own breathing. Then he heard it, distant at first but growing louder, a low chant, hundreds of voices in unison coming from the north. Tenoheka Banzai. Long live the Emperor. It was happening. The human wave. The nightmare scenario Morrison had described in the briefing. And Hayes was sitting in a metal chair with 4 guns and a 75-cent wrench, about to find out if his father's advice about fixing things right was enough to keep 120 men alive. The chanting grew louder. Chen's voice came over the radio one last time, high and tight with stress. They're coming. Hundreds of them. God, there's so many. Hayes gripped the spade handles. He lowered the guns until the barrels were almost horizontal, pointed directly at the tree line 200 yards away. The red ring of the optical sight floated in the darkness waiting. Morrison's voice echoed across the perimeter, calm and clear, despite the approaching storm. "Steady, boys. Wait for the flares. Wait for targets." Hayes's thumb rested on the trigger. His heart hammered in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to abandon the vehicle, to find a hole in the ground and hide. But he didn't move, because 120 men were counting on him, because his brother Danny was back in Detroit safe, because Hayes had made a promise, because his father had taught him that when you fix something, you fix it right, no matter the cost. The chanting reached a crescendo. Then it stopped. The jungle went silent, and in that terrible quiet, Jack Hayes heard the sound of hundreds of boots beginning to run. A flare ignited overhead, fired by the American mortar team. It drifted down on a parachute, bathing the clearing in stark, flickering white light. The wall of jungle dissolved. It didn't melt. It parted. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers stepped out of the tree line at once, screaming, rifles raised, bayonets fixed. They weren't hiding anymore. They were charging. Hayes took a breath. He placed the red ring over the center of the mass of running men, and he pulled the trigger. The quad mount roared. The jungle erupted in fire, and the night that would change everything exploded into chaos. The sound wasn't like a machine gun. It was a continuous tearing noise, like a giant sheet of canvas being ripped apart by God. The muzzle blast from 450 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously created a vacuum that sucked the oxygen out of the air. The effect on the charging wave was instantaneous and absolute. Hayes had set his convergence for 200 yards, but the enemy was closer than that. This meant his 4 streams of fire hadn't fully merged yet. They were 4 separate scythes of flame cutting through the dark. The tracers, loaded 1 and 3, created a solid beam of light that looked like a laser. Where that beam touched the enemy line, the line simply vanished. The 50 caliber round is a massive projectile. It doesn't just poke holes, it smashes bone and liquefies tissue. When 4 of them hit a human body at the same split second, the result is not a wound. It is a disassembly. The front rank of the banzai charge didn't fall down. They were physically pushed backward, lifted off their feet by the sheer kinetic energy of the impact. It looked like they had run into an invisible glass wall at full speed. The men behind them were hit by the shrapnel of their own comrades, and the high-velocity armor piercing rounds that punched through the first target to kill the second and third. Hayes swept the turret from left to right. The electric motor emitted a rising whine, spinning the heavy guns with terrifying speed. He didn't have to fight the recoil. The heavy mount absorbed it all. He just pointed the electric chainsaw and watched the world disappear. The tracer stream hit the center of the charge. It was like watching a fire hose wash away mud. The mass of Japanese infantry, which had looked unstoppable seconds ago, evaporated into a pink mist. The jungle edge itself began to disintegrate. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds didn't stop when they hit flesh. They continued into the tree line. The tungsten cores smashed through the mahogany trunks. The incendiary tips ignited on impact. The trees didn't just catch fire. They exploded into splinters. Massive branches sheared off by the volume of lead crashed down onto the attacking troops. The brush caught fire, casting a hellish red glow over the killing field. Hayes was literally deforesting the landscape in real time. He was cutting the jungle down to ground level, removing the enemy's cover by removing the forest itself. The American infantrymen in the foxholes had stopped firing. They realized they were just wasting ammunition. They watched in awe as the stream of tracers swept back and forth, a glowing whip that cracked the air. They saw Japanese soldiers who moments ago had been terrifying warriors throw themselves into the mud to escape the scythe. The psychological impact was total. The banzai spirit relied on the belief that spiritual strength could overcome material superiority. Hayes was proving that belief wrong 2,000 rounds at a time. But the Japanese were not done. The initial wave had been shattered, but the heavy weapons teams in the rear were still active. Hayes heard the sound he'd been dreading, the distinctive crack of a Japanese mountain gun. A 75mm shell screamed out of the darkness and exploded 20 yards to the left of the half-track. The concussion rocked the vehicle, rattling Hayes's teeth and spraying mud over his optical sight. Shrapnel deflected off the armored batwing shields that protected his seat. Hayes didn't flinch. He didn't try to wipe the mud off his sight. He knew where the shot had come from. He'd seen the muzzle flash in the trees, a brief yellow flower that bloomed and died. He spun the turret toward it. He didn't need to be precise. He didn't need to thread a needle. He just needed to saturate the grid square. He depressed the guns slightly and unleashed a 5-second burst. 5 seconds doesn't sound like a long time, but in the world of the quad mount, 5 seconds is 160 rounds of 50 caliber hate. The tracers drew a line straight to the hidden artillery piece. The rounds smashed into the gun shield, punched through the wheels, and shredded the crew. The ammunition stacked near the gun took a hit. A secondary explosion blossomed in the trees, a violent orange fireball that told Hayes he had connected. The mountain gun fell silent. The Japanese mortar teams were next. They were trying to walk their rounds onto the half-track, sensing that it was the anchor of the American defense. Hayes saw the sparks of the launch tubes. He traversed the turret right, the motors humming a high-pitched note of aggression. He walked his fire into the mortar pits. The incendiary rounds set the camouflage netting on fire. The heavy slugs churned the earth, burying the mortars, and the men operating them in a landslide of dirt and lead. It was a duel between indirect fire, and direct fire was winning. Hayes was working in a trance state. The heat from the 4 barrels was radiating back at him, washing over his face in waves. The smell of burning gunpowder and ozone was thick in his nose. The vibration of the guns rattled his bones, but his hands were steady on the control yoke. He was playing the turret like an instrument. He swung left to catch a group of stragglers trying to flank the foxholes. He swung right to hammer a sniper trying to climb a tree. He was the eye of the storm, the pivot point around which the entire battle revolved. Morrison had taken control of the infantry fire, organizing it into sectors, ensuring no gaps. The synergy was perfect. Hayes created dead zones where nothing could survive. The riflemen picked off anything that tried to move between those zones. Together, they had turned the perimeter into a killing machine. But Hayes could feel the weapons starting to fail. Gun number 3 on the right side of the mount was running too hot. He could see the barrel glowing a dull red even in the darkness. The metal was expanding from the heat, and the tolerances were getting sloppy. Suddenly, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A sharp crack, and gun number 3 stopped firing. A round had cooked off in the chamber, firing spontaneously from the heat. The barrel had warped. The gun was dead. 3 guns left. Hayes adjusted his aim to compensate for the asymmetric recoil. It was like driving a car with 3 wheels. Harder but doable. He kept firing. A second wave tried to form up in the ravine to the north. They were screaming, trying to regain the momentum. Hayes heard them. He spun the turret 90 degrees facing to the rear. The half-track was open-topped, vulnerable, but the turret could cover every angle. He elevated the gun slightly, aiming for the lip of the ravine. He fired blind, using the tracers to guide him. The rounds arched over the edge and plunged into the depression. The screaming changed pitch. It went from a war cry to a cry of panic. The ricochets bounced around the rocky ravine, creating a kill zone that no one could survive. The second wave broke before it could even crest the hill. Then gun number 1 jammed. A belt link had snapped from the heat expansion and stress. The gun choked, stopped. 2 guns left. Hayes felt panic rising in his throat. The enemy was still moving. He could hear them in the jungle, regrouping, trying to find a way through. And he was down to half his firepower. Chen's voice cut through the radio, sharp with pain. "Contact behind you, squad. Moving on your blind spot." Hayes tried to traverse the turret, but the vehicle's own structure created a dead zone directly behind the half-track. He couldn't get the guns around fast enough. He was about to die, and there was nothing he could do about it. Then he heard rifle fire. Not the heavy bark of the Garand. The lighter, faster crack of the M1 carbine. Chen had left his observation post. Hayes could see him running across the clearing toward the threat, firing from the hip. Chen engaged 8 Japanese soldiers who were trying to sneak up on the half-track's blind spot. He killed 3, wounded 2, delayed the rest long enough for them to be cut down by infantry fire from the foxholes. But Chen went down. Hayes saw him fall, clutching his shoulder. A bayonet wound, blood spreading dark across his uniform. Kowalski broke from his position and sprinted toward Chen, dragging him back to cover, while Washington laid down suppressive fire. Hayes wanted to help, wanted to climb down and make sure Chen was alive. But he couldn't. If he left the turret, everyone died. So he stayed, and he kept firing, and he hated himself for it. The barrels were dangerously hot now. Gun number 2 was glowing orange. Hayes could see smoke rising from the grease on the action. He was running out of time. The weapon was eating itself, and the Japanese were still out there. He heard Morrison on the radio calling to battalion headquarters. "We need artillery support." Fire mission grid coordinates. The response came back. Negative, danger close. Too near friendly positions. We cannot authorize, Morrison cursed. Then he made a decision that would define the rest of the night. All units, Morrison said over the radio. New orders. When the next wave comes, nobody fires until I give the command. Hayes, that includes you. Wait for my signal. Hayes keyed his radio. Sir, if they charge, I need to fire immediately. If I wait, they'll be too close. I know, Morrison said. That's the point. Trust me. Hayes felt his stomach drop. Morrison was planning something insane, and Hayes had no choice but to go along with it. The jungle was quiet again. The Japanese were regrouping. Hayes used the pause to check his remaining ammunition. Gun number 2 had maybe 500 rounds left before the belt ran out. Gun number 4 had about the same. 1,000 rounds total. Against how many Japanese he didn't know. But it wasn't enough. Not if they came all at once. Washington climbed onto the half-track with Kowalski. They brought the last ammunition crates, the absolute final reserves. They swapped them in silence, working fast. Washington looked at Hayes. His face was grim. This is it, kid. After this, we're dry. Make them count. How's Chen? Hayes asked. Kowalski answered. Alive, barely. Shoulders bad. Medic says he needs evac. Hayes felt something twist in his chest. Chen had saved his life, and Hayes couldn't even thank him. Just keep him breathing, Hayes said. Please. We will, Washington said. He squeezed Hayes' shoulder, then jumped down. Kowalski paused before following. He looked at Hayes with an expression that was complicated. Respect mixed with fear, mixed with something that might have been gratitude. For what it's worth, Kowalski said, I'm glad you're here. Glad you didn't listen to Morrison when he told you to leave. We'd all be dead without you. It was the most honest thing Kowalski had ever said to him. Then Kowalski was gone, and Hayes was alone in the turret again, waiting for whatever Morrison had planned. Morrison's voice came over the radio, speaking to the entire company. Listen up. Intelligence says we're facing about 400 Japanese soldiers still combat effective. They've taken massive casualties, but they're not retreating. They're going to hit us one more time. Everything they have, all at once. Our ammunition is low. Our machine guns are overheating. By the book, we should be calling for withdrawal. But we're not withdrawing. We're going to do something they don't expect. He paused. When they charge, we're going to let them get close. Real close, 50 meters. And then every man in this perimeter is going to fire everything he has at the same time. Rifles, machine guns, grenades, everything. We're going to put so much lead in the air that nothing survives. But it only works if we wait. If anyone fires early, they'll scatter and flank us. We have to let them bunch up. We have to make them think they're winning. And then we kill them all at once. Hayes understood now. Morrison was gambling everything on one synchronized volley. It was insane. It was brilliant. And it required nerves of steel from every man in the perimeter, especially Hayes, because the Japanese would see the half-track. They'd recognize it as the weapon that had torn them apart. They'd focus their charge on destroying it. And Hayes would have to sit there watching them come, not firing until Morrison gave the word. If Morrison's timing was wrong, if the enemy got inside 50 meters, they'd overrun the position. If Hayes broke and fired early, the charge would scatter and come from multiple angles. Everything depended on discipline, on trust, on faith that Morrison knew what he was doing. Hayes took a deep breath. He gripped the spade handles, and he waited. The chanting began again. Tenohaka Banzai, but this time it was different, louder, angrier, desperate. This was the last throw of the dice for the Japanese commander. Win or die. There was no middle ground. Chen's replacement in the observation post, a young private whose voice shook, came over the radio. They're forming up, all of them. This is it. Morrison's response was calm, steady. Hold your fire. Wait for my command. The chanting grew to a roar. Then it cut off, the signal to charge. Hayes heard the boots, hundreds of them, pounding the earth, getting closer. A flare went up. The Japanese were using their own illumination now, wanting to see the Americans die. The clearing lit up stark white, and Hayes saw them. 400 men, maybe more, sprinting across the open ground. Rifles raised, bayonets glinting, faces twisted in fury. They were screaming, individual voices lost in the collective roar. They were a wave of flesh and steel and hate, and they were aimed directly at Hayes. Morrison's voice hold. The Japanese were at 300 meters, closing fast. Hayes placed the red ring over the center of the mass. His thumb hovered over the trigger. Every instinct screamed to fire, to shoot now while he had time and distance. But he didn't, because Morrison had said to wait. 250 meters. Morrison hold. 200 meters, exactly where Hayes had set the convergence. The perfect range, the ideal kill zone. His hand shook on the trigger, not from fear, from the sheer effort of not pulling it. Morrison hold. 150 meters. Hayes could see individual faces now. Young men, old men, some barely looked 16, all of them running to kill him, all of them about to die. 100 meters. The infantry in the foxholes were panicking. Hayes could hear it in their breathing over the radio. Someone fired, a single rifle shot. Morrison screamed, "Who fired?" "Hold your goddamn fire." 75 meters. Too close. This was too close. They were going to make it. They were going to reach the foxholes. Hayes started to squeeze the trigger. Morrison not yet. 60 meters. Hayes could smell them. Sweat and sake and gun oil. He could hear their individual voices. Battle cries. Prayers. Curses. 55 meters. Morrison's whistle blew. The sharp trilling blast cut through the K. Fire, fire, everything. Hayes's thumbs crushed the triggers. Both remaining guns erupted. But this time he wasn't alone. Every rifle in the perimeter fired at once. 50 M1 Garands, the clips ejecting with metallic pings. 6 M19 machine guns, their chattering overlapping into a sustained roar. Grenades flew through the air, dozens of them arching over the charging line. The combined firepower was apocalyptic. Hayes's 250 caliber streams converged at 50 meters, right where Morrison had calculated the enemy would be. The tungsten cord rounds met the charging mass like a solid wall. The infantry bullets filled the spaces between. The grenades airbursted overhead, raining shrapnel down. For 3 seconds, the Americans put 1,500 rounds into a space the size of a basketball court. The effect was total. The front rank simply ceased to exist. Disintegrated, the second rank was hit by the shrapnel and over-penetrating bullets. The third rank, realizing what was happening, tried to stop. But momentum carried them forward into the kill zone. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The Japanese charge didn't slow down. It evaporated. Men fell in heaps. The survivors tried to flee. But Hayes was still firing. The infantry was still firing. There was no escape, no mercy, just the mathematics of overwhelming firepower applied to a confined space. Hayes held the trigger for 10 seconds. Then gun number 4 failed. The barrel split lengthwise from the heat stress. The metal parted like a peeled banana, venting hot gas. Hayes was down to 1 gun, 1 barrel, 500 rounds. But it didn't matter anymore. The charge was broken. The survivors were running back to the jungle, not in an organized retreat. In a rout, every man for himself. Morrison's voice, "Cease fire, cease fire, conserve ammunition." The shooting stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Hayes released the triggers. His hands wouldn't straighten. They were locked in position, cramped into claws. He stared at the field in front of the half-track. It didn't look like a battlefield. It looked like the end of the world. Bodies everywhere, scattered, broken. The ground was no longer brown. It was red. The mud had turned to soup. The smell was indescribable. Copper and shit and burned meat. Hayes tried to stand. His legs gave out. He collapsed in the turret seat. Washington was there, suddenly climbing up, catching him. "Easy, kid, easy. We got you." Hayes looked at him. His vision was blurry. His ears were ringing so loud he could barely hear. "Did we win?" he asked. Washington looked out at the devastation, then back at Hayes. His eyes were wet. "Yeah, kid, we won." Hayes nodded. Then he leaned over the side of the turret and vomited. Everything came up. Fear, adrenaline, horror. He heaved until there was nothing left. Washington held his shoulder, keeping him from falling. When Hayes finally stopped, Washington handed him a canteen. "Drink." Hayes drank. The water tasted like metal. He looked at the quad mount. 3 guns destroyed, 1 barely functional. The turret was scorched black. Brass casings were piled so deep they spilled over the sides. The smell of burned gunpowder was so thick it was hard to breathe. "Where's Chen?" Hayes asked. Washington's expression darkened. "He's alive. Medics got him. But he's hurt bad, Jack. Real bad. Hayes tried to stand again. This time his legs held. I need to see him. Morrison appeared at the base of the half-track. His face was unreadable. Hayes, with me, now. Hayes climbed down his body, moving on autopilot. Morrison led him away from the vehicle toward the command post. Hayes expected anger, expected blame, expected something. What he got was silence. Morrison stopped at the edge of the perimeter where they could see the whole battlefield. He looked out at the carnage for a long moment. Then he said, I counted, best I could in the dark, 647 enemy dead in our sector, maybe another 100 wounded who crawled away. He turned to Hayes. My company is 120 men. We took 8 killed, 23 wounded. Without you, we'd have been wiped out, every single one of us. Hayes said nothing. Morrison continued, you understand what you did tonight. You didn't just stop an attack, you changed the war. By tomorrow morning, every infantry commander in the division is going to hear about this. They're going to want quad mounts. They're going to want you to teach their gunners how to do what you did. This isn't going to stay quiet. Hayes found his voice. Sir, I just fixed the gun, that's all. I just made it work the way it should have worked. Morrison shook his head. You did more than that. You proved that one man with the right tool and the right knowledge can change everything. The brass are going to want to know how. They're going to want to replicate this. Will they court-martial me? Hayes asked. For modifying the weapon, Morrison laughed. It was a harsh, bitter sound. Son, they're going to give you a goddamn medal. He paused. I'm recommending you for the Bronze Star, Chen Tu. That kid saved your life. Probably saved all of us. How is he? Morrison's expression softened. He'll live, but his war is over. Shoulders torn up bad. They're evasing him to Manila in the morning. You should talk to him before he goes. Hayes nodded. Morrison stuck out his hand. Hayes shook it. Morrison's grip was firm. Thank you, Sergeant Hayes, for not listening to me when I told you to leave. For being stubborn enough to fix what was broken. For saving my men. Hayes didn't know what to say to that, so he just said, yes, sir. He found Chen in the aid station, a canvas tent lit by lanterns. Chen was on a stretcher, his shoulder wrapped in bloody bandages. A morphine syringe stuck out of his arm. His eyes were half closed, but he opened them when Hayes knelt beside him. Hey, Chen said. His voice was weak. We win. Yeah, we won. Chen smiled. It was a tired, pained expression. Good. Told you it would work. The convergence thing. Basic geometry. Hayes felt his throat tighten. You saved my life, Jimmy. That squad behind me, if you hadn't. Chen waved his good hand dismissively. You'd have done the same. Besides, what's the point of proving I'm American if I don't act like it? Americans help each other. Right, Hayes said. Chen's eyes started to close. The morphine was pulling him under. Before he went, he said one more thing. Your brother, Danny, he's lucky to have you. Hayes stayed there until Chen fell asleep. Then he walked back out into the night. The sky was starting to lighten in the east. Dawn was coming. The company was cleaning up, collecting weapons, checking bodies, digging graves for the American dead. Kowalski was helping with the wounded. When he saw Hayes, he stood up and walked over. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Kowalski said, I was wrong about you, about the gun, about everything. You're not a tourist. You're the reason we're alive. Hayes looked at him. Kowalski looked back, and in that moment something shifted. The hatred was gone, replaced by respect, maybe even friendship. Thanks for helping with the ammo, Hayes said. Couldn't have done it without you. Kowalski nodded, then he held out his hand. Hayes shook it. When Kowalski walked away, Washington appeared. He had 2 cups of coffee. Actual coffee, not the instant shit. He handed one to Hayes. Where'd you get this? Hayes asked. Morrison's private stash. He said you earned it. They stood there in silence, watching the sun come up over the jungle. The light turned the smoke golden. It almost looked beautiful. Almost. You know what happens now? Washington asked. Hayes shook his head. Washington smiled. Now you become a legend. By noon, every soldier in the division is going to know your name. The mechanic who turned a toy into a weapon. The kid who held the line. Hayes didn't want that. He didn't want to be a legend. He just wanted to go home. Wanted to see Danny and Mary and work on cars and forget this night ever happened. But he knew that wasn't going to happen. He'd changed something, proven something, and the Army wasn't going to let that go. Morrison had been right. This was going to spread, and Hayes was going to be at the center of it. The following days proved Morrison correct. Word of the engagement spread through the 25th Infantry Division like wildfire. By February 16th, Hayes had been summoned to battalion headquarters to give a detailed account of the action. By February 18th, division headquarters wanted a demonstration. By February 21st, Hayes was standing in front of 30 anti-aircraft gunners, teaching them how to modify their weapons for ground support. The official doctrine changed within a week. The Army issued a field manual addendum authorizing the use of M16 multiple-gun motor carriages in direct ground support roles. The modification Hayes had pioneered, ground convergence, harmonization, became standard procedure. Every quad mount in the Pacific Theater was adjusted to the 200-yard setting. The results were immediate. In the final months of the Philippine campaign, Japanese banzai attacks against positions defended by quad mounts had a failure rate of 98%. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders was severe. Intelligence intercepts showed orders being issued to avoid sectors with the four-headed machine gun. They called it different names: the Devil's Breath, the American Demon, the Meat Grinder. But Hayes didn't see most of this. On March 1st, he was rotated back to a rear area for what the Army called technical consultation. In reality, they wanted him to write training manuals and conduct schools. He spent 3 months teaching other soldiers what he'd learned in one night. He was good at it, patient, thorough. He made sure every gunner understood not just how to do it, but why it worked. In August of 1945, Japan surrendered. The war was over. Hayes received his discharge papers in September and boarded a transport ship home. He carried with him a Bronze Star with V device for valor, a Purple Heart for the minor shrapnel wounds he'd sustained, and a letter from Morrison that he never showed anyone. The letter said in part, "You asked me once if fixing things right was enough. I'm writing to tell you that it is. You saved 112 lives on February 14th, but the doctrine you created has saved thousands more. Men I'll never meet are alive because you were stubborn enough to use a wrench when everyone told you to stop. That's not just fixing things right, that's changing the world." Hayes returned to Detroit in October of 1945. Danny met him at the train station. His brother looked older, more serious. Mary was there too, 17 now, no longer the 12-year-old girl he'd left behind. They drove home in silence. Hayes looked out the window at the familiar streets and felt nothing. He was home, but home felt foreign. He reopened the garage. The sign still said Hayes Auto Repair. He went back to fixing carburetors and timing belts and worn brake pads. Customers would ask where he'd been. He'd say the Philippines. They'd ask if he'd seen combat. He'd say yes. They'd want details. He'd change the subject. In 1947, Hayes married a woman named Sarah. She worked at the diner down the street. She knew he'd been in the war, but she didn't push him to talk about it. They had 3 children: Thomas, born in 1948, Elizabeth, born in 1950, and Henry, named after Hayes's father, born in 1952. Hayes was a good father, patient, attentive. He taught his sons how to fix things, taught his daughter too when she showed interest. He coached Little League baseball. He went to church on Sundays. He was by all appearances a normal man living a normal life. But there were signs, small things that his family noticed but didn't understand. He couldn't stand fireworks. The sound made him flinch, made him grip the arms of his chair until his knuckles went white. Sometimes Sarah would wake in the night and find him sitting in the kitchen, staring at nothing, his hands moving through motions she couldn't identify. Years later, she realized he'd been checking guns that weren't there. He never talked about Luzon, never mentioned the quad mount, never told his children that their father had killed hundreds of men in a single night. The only time the subject came up was in 1967, when Hayes received a phone call from an Army lieutenant colonel. The officer explained that the modifications Hayes had pioneered in 1945 were being used in Vietnam. The M16 half-track was obsolete, but the principle remained. They'd mounted quad mounts on 5-ton trucks, created what they called gun trucks, and were using them to defend convoys. The officer wanted Hayes's advice on improving the system. Hayes spent 3 days at Aberdeen Proving Ground consulting. He saw the new generation of weapons, faster, more powerful, built on the foundation he'd laid 22 years earlier. The young soldiers who operated them had no idea who Hayes was. To them, he was just an old mechanic the brass had brought in. But the officers knew, and they treated Hayes with a deference that made him uncomfortable. On the last day, a general pulled Hayes aside. He said, "Do you know how many American lives your innovation has saved?" Across your 3 wars, Hayes said he didn't want to know. The general told him anyway. Estimated 10,000, maybe more. From Korea to Vietnam. All because you refused to accept that a weapon was being used wrong. Hayes went home. He told Sarah about the trip, but not about the number. 10,000 was too big, too heavy. He couldn't carry that. So he put it away, same as he'd put away everything else from the war. In 1973, Morrison died. Hayes learned about it from a letter Morrison's widow sent. She said Morrison had talked about Hayes often, had kept the after-action report from February 14th framed on his office wall, had told anyone who'd listen about the kid who saved his company with a wrench and stubborn pride. Hayes went to the funeral. It was in Virginia. He drove 12 hours to get there. The service was full of old soldiers men Morrison had served with over 3 decades. Hayes sat in the back. He didn't introduce himself. But after the burial, Morrison's widow found him. She handed him an envelope. "Morrison wanted you to have this," she said. "He wrote it last month. Knew he was dying." Hayes opened the envelope that night in a motel room outside Richmond. The letter was short. Jack had said, "I'm writing this because I want to make sure you know. What you did mattered, not just that night, but every day since. You proved that the individual still matters. That one person thinking clearly, acting bravely, can change the outcome. The Army taught me to follow doctrine. You taught me that doctrine is just a starting point. Fix it right, you told me. That became my philosophy. I passed it on to every soldier I commanded, and they passed it on to theirs. You didn't just save lives, you changed how we think about problems. Thank you for that, for being stubborn when I wanted to throw you out, for being right when I was wrong, for showing me that an old dog can still learn if the teacher is good enough. Your friend Tom Morrison." Hayes sat on the motel bed and cried. He hadn't cried since the war, hadn't let himself. But Morrison's words broke something open. All the weight he'd been carrying, all the bodies he'd seen, all the nightmares he'd refused to acknowledge. It came out in that dingy room, and Hayes let it. The next morning he drove home. He didn't tell Sarah where he'd been, just said he'd gone for a drive, needed to clear his head. She didn't push, she never pushed, and Hayes went back to fixing cars and coaching baseball and being a normal man. In 1998, at the age of 75, Jack Hayes died of a heart attack. It was quick, painless. He was in his garage underneath a Chevy pickup when it happened. Danny found him an hour later. The funeral was well attended. Friends, family, customers whose cars Hayes had fixed over 50 years. The pastor gave a nice eulogy about a man who'd served his country and his community with quiet dignity. There was no mention of Luzon, no mention of the Quad Mount, no mention of the 647 Japanese soldiers killed in one night. But at the back of the church, there was a group of men in their 70s. They wore suits, but they stood like soldiers. They didn't sit with the family, didn't introduce themselves, but they were there for the entire service. And when the burial was finished, one of them approached Danny. "Your father," the man said, "was a hero. Did you know that?" Danny said he knew his father had been in the war, but Hayes had never talked about it. The old soldier nodded. "He was in my unit. February of 45. Luzon. We got hit by a bonsai charge. 800 Japanese soldiers. Your father was the only thing that stopped them. Saved all our lives." He handed Danny a piece of paper. It was worn creased from being folded and unfolded many times. It was the after-action report from February 14th, 1945, signed by Captain Thomas Morrison. Danny read it standing there at the graveside, read about the modification, the convergence, the night his father had held the line. When he finished, he looked up. The old soldiers were gone. That night, Danny went through his father's belongings, found the shoebox in the closet. Inside were the medals, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and a letter from Morrison dated 1973. Danny read it, then he called his siblings. They came over, and Danny showed them. They sat around the kitchen table, the 3 children of Jack Hayes, and learned for the first time what their father had done. Thomas, the oldest, said, "Why didn't he tell us?" Danny shook his head. "Because he didn't want us to know him as the guy who killed people. He wanted us to know him as Dad, the mechanic, the coach. That's who he wanted to be." Elizabeth, the daughter, picked up the Bronze Star. She turned it over in her hands. "So what do we do with this? Do we tell people?" Danny thought about it. Then he said, "We do what he would have wanted. We put it back in the box. We remember. But we don't make it a big thing. He was just a mechanic who fixed things. That's what he'd want us to say." And that's what they did. The medals went back in the box. The box went back in the closet. And Jack Hayes was remembered as a good father, a skilled mechanic, and a man who'd served his country quietly. But the story didn't end there. In 2004, a military historian researching the use of anti-aircraft weapons and ground rules stumbled across Morrison's after-action report in the National Archives. He published a paper on it. The paper caught the attention of a larger audience. Suddenly, Jack Hayes was being mentioned in books about World War II innovation, in documentaries about the Pacific Theater, in lectures at West Point about individual initiative. Hayes's grandson, James, born in 1981, learned about his grandfather's service through one of these documentaries. He reached out to the historian, asked for more information. The historian connected him with the few surviving members of Morrison's company. Men in their 90s now, but they remembered. One of them was Kowalski. Eddie Kowalski, 91 years old, living in a retirement home in Pennsylvania. James visited him. Kowalski's memory was sharp. He remembered everything. The Dragon Wagon, the night Hayes fired the test shot, the bonsai charge. He remembered helping load ammunition while bullets flew overhead. Your grandfather, Kowalski said, was the most stubborn son of a bitch I ever met. And I mean that as the highest compliment. He wouldn't accept that things were broken. He fixed them. And in fixing them, he saved my life. I was 22 years old, thought I was going to die in that jungle. But Hayes wouldn't let it happen. James recorded the interview, brought it back to his family. They listened to Kowalski describe Jack Hayes not as a father or grandfather, but as a soldier, a hero, a legend. And they started to understand the weight their father had carried, the choice he'd made to put it down and just be dad. In 2024, the Army inducted Jack Hayes into the Ordnance Corps Hall of Fame. It was a posthumous honor. The ceremony was held at Aberdeen Proving Ground, the same place Hayes had consulted in 1967. His 3 children attended, his grandchildren, even a few great-grandchildren. A brigadier general gave a speech about innovation and individual initiative, about how one sergeant with a wrench had changed doctrine across 3 wars, about how the lineage of the quad mount ran through Korea, Vietnam, and into modern systems like the Phalanx, C1WS, and CRAM, about how estimated 50,000 American lives had been saved directly or indirectly by Hayes's modification. After the ceremony, they unveiled a plaque. It read, Sergeant Jack Hayes, 1922 to 1998, mechanic, soldier, innovator. He proved that fixing things right can change the world. Danny stood in front of that plaque for a long time. He thought about his father, about the garage, about the nights Dad would sit in the kitchen, hands moving through phantom motions, about the weight of carrying that history in silence, about the choice to be remembered as a father instead of a killer. He thought about Morrison's letter, fix it right, lives depend on it. And he understood finally why those words had meant so much to his father, because they weren't just about machines. They were about everything, about doing the work, about taking responsibility, about refusing to accept broken systems because that's how they've always been. Danny had 3 sons of his own. He taught them to fix things, passed on the lessons his father had taught him. Work carefully, think clearly, don't cut corners. If it's worth doing right. He'd never connected those lessons to the war, to Luzon, to the quad mount. But now he did. And he realized that his father's real legacy wasn't the lives saved in combat. It was the principle, the stubborn insistence that things can be better, that broken systems can be fixed, that the individual still matters. That night in his hotel room, Danny wrote a letter to his sons. He told them about their grandfather, about the garage and the war and the medals in the shoebox, about the choice to carry weight in silence, about the importance of fixing things right. He ended the letter with this, your great-grandfather saved thousands of lives with a 75-cent wrench and the refusal to accept that something couldn't be improved. But his real gift wasn't the modification. It was the mindset, the belief that we can always do better, that excellence matters, that our work, whatever it is, affects other people. He taught me to fix carburetors, but really he was teaching me to fix problems, to think clearly under pressure, to not accept broken as normal. That's his legacy, not the Bronze Star, not the Hall of Fame plaque, just the quiet insistence that we can and should do better. Fix it right. Lives depend on it. That's what it means to be a Hayes. That's what your great-grandfather left us. Not glory, not fame, just the tools to make things better. One problem at a time, one careful adjustment at a time, until the world is a little bit less broken than we found it. Danny folded the letter. He'd give it to his sons when they were old enough to understand, when they faced their own broken systems and had to decide whether to accept them or fix them. When they needed to know that one person thinking clearly, acting carefully, really could change things. Outside the hotel window, the lights of Aberdeen Proving Ground glittered in the darkness. Somewhere in those buildings, engineers were working on the next generation of weapons, building on principles first proven in a Philippine jungle in 1945. Principles that said individual innovation matters, that doctrine is a starting point, not an ending, that a mechanic with a good idea can change warfare. But Jack Hayes wouldn't have cared about that. He'd have cared about the letter Danny was writing, about passing on the lessons, about making sure the next generation understood that excellence isn't about glory. It's about responsibility, about fixing things right because lives in ways you might never see depend on it. That was the real story, not the night of fire and blood, not the 647 dead or the 112 saved, but the choice made every day for 53 years to carry that weight quietly, to be a father and a mechanic and a coach, to teach by example that greatness doesn't need to announce itself, to just fix things right every time, no matter what, because lives depend on it.